Welcome and Happy New Year. I hope you all had good holidays and got some rest and come back refreshed. As you know, the campaign has long been interested in community schools as one of the big bet strategies for at once engaging communities and meeting the needs of the whole child. And just as we were all leaving at the end of last year, Congress took some very big action with respect to community schools. So here's what we're going to do today in this kind of hybrid broadcast. First, we're going to go and have new conversations with a couple of the big leaders in the field, José Munoz from the Coalition for Community Schools and Hayin Kimner from Brookings Institute and the California work on community schools. We're going to get that update on what Congress did. And then we're going to go back and look at the session that we had last year, in which we looked at community schools work at the state level, at the federal level, and at the community level. I think altogether it will give you a really good package of some of the most interesting and energizing work going on in this space right now. It's extremely encouraging, and there are great new opportunities available. So again, thanks for joining. And now let's hear what José and Hayin have to say in their updates. Thanks so much for joining us. And as you know, we're going to be doing a little replay of some of the conversation we had last year, but there were some big developments near the end of the year. So we'd love to hear a little summary of what happened with the Congress considering the omnibus legislation at the end of December.
Well, hey, way to finish off a year by achieving some of your resolutions, right?
Love that.
So we started off the year as a coalition, many hundreds of partners across the country, national, statewide, and local, advocating for increased funding for community schools. As you may remember, last year was historical because the amount of allocation had doubled. So we finished off this year with not with the $468 million that the Biden administration had asked for and that the House had approved, but we're able to sustain $150 million for a new allocation coming up for the full service community schools grant. So it was a great year for that to end with maintaining that in the budget.
Wow, $150 million new dollars, you're saying.
Yes, sir.
Who's eligible for that money? To remind us, who's eligible for that money, and for what purposes can that money be used?
Well, that's the great thing. Most folks think because it's flowing through the U.S. Department of Education that only local education agencies, school districts, and state education agencies, the state offices have to apply. But this is realizing what the true essence of community schools bring, where anyone who is interested in the well-being of young people, their families, and their community could apply. So those who are eligible, from United Ways to universities to grassroots organizations to local governments, of course your LEAs and SEAs, but any organization that can bring together a consortium, form a coalition to sustain the work, but also scale it.
Wow, that's huge. So tell us what some of the priorities that are laid out in the legislation for what funds can be used to do.
Yeah, so interesting in this as well too. We were able to bring a lot of folks together to help inform the priorities. The federal government did a great job of reaching out to many different stakeholders across the country to form these priorities. And so what came down to were like 5 different priorities that folks could actually apply this funding for. And it also describes some of the who's. So the first is just like the first 2 priorities kind of give you the geography. So good. Priority 1 is like mainly the urban places you can apply for, or larger consortiums. Priority 2 is mainly for rural. The eligibility is rural districts, small and rural, and low income. So after that, the other 3 priorities, Hey, some of this is like, if you're brand new, don't know anything about it, capacity building and development, if you want to create a regional approach with multiple local education agencies, more than one school district, then you can go to another priorities for. And then what if you're a state? So this is the first time ever. This is the first time ever that folks have applied for last year, and I'm going off of last year's, where state funding could be available. So of course I am saying this based off of last year's award, but because of the amount of engagement happening and has happened, I can't imagine that changing too much, but they can always change their priorities from year to year. But that's what they were for last year. So we have to put our work in this year to help shape that this year.
That's fantastic. It's so encouraging. It's nice to start the new year with this positivity that you're bringing. I love that. Tell me then, what you think, what does this tell you about what's happening with community schools? I mean, you all have set an enormous goal, ambitious goal. Are you feeling like there's increasing momentum, increasing interest in communities and among policyholders? I mean, what's your take on what's going on here?
Johnson, I live out of my suitcase on the airplane and hotel rooms. And I've been able to interact just this last half of the year with state school boards. I've been able to interact with National Governors Association, working with them on here. I've been able to work and listen to United Ways and universities and local communities. There is so much momentum in the interest of community schools on all different levels, regardless what your role is and what level you work on. Last year, during the last full service community schools grant program, our team did a fantastic job of supporting the full service community school grant. Let me just give you some of the numbers to help even clarify some of this interest.
Great.
We had the team in 60 days, less than 60 days, when the grant was announced last year, we were only able to conduct between 60 and 70 individualized coaching sessions of how to think about applying for the grant. We had over 2,000 folks participate in webinar series to help prepare for the grant, and over 12,000 people actually had open rates as far as the resources to prepare for this. So we haven't seen this. I don't know the numbers yet at the federal level as far as how many applicants there were. I think we should get that pretty soon. But I can't imagine it not at least doubling over recent years. Wow,
that is fantastic. We see stuff in the news about education, and it's so often about these conflicts that ultimately seem really kind of peripheral. And this feels like an enormous story of something really big happening in the world of education and communities and young people. And I just fear it's not in the news, but it feels like this is a real rising tide, and very much credit to the work that you and your colleagues have done over a long time to prepare for this moment.
Well, you say it's not in the news. Are you giving me a New Year's resolution for 2023?
There you go.
I think you just did. So, this is a pivotal time, and this just is one of those things where it just makes sense. Whether you're Republican or Democrat or independent, it just makes sense that young people need a community to support them. Now they may talk about it differently, but who doesn't want a greater efficiency in our taxes? Who doesn't want to care for the most vulnerable people in their own local community? Who doesn't want to do that? So this is one of those things that our elected officials and those running for office have to argue about, to be or not to be. This is one of those things that they argue, like, whatever you do, we're going to do better. So
Yeah,
how do
yeah,
you support community schools? We're going to
yeah.
support it better in this way.
That's
It's
fantastic.
just a unifying moment, and I've witnessed that even locally. So it's great to see this in
That's
this.
fantastic. Well, I applaud what you've accomplished and what you're doing. And yes, for 2023, let's work together and make sure that more people understand that this is a really important story of one of the big stories of what's unfolding in the world of kids, schools, communities, education.
For sure, and I can't wait to continue working with the campaign for grade level reading and all that you all
Great.
do. Really appreciate you.
Thanks so much. Well, here we are back again, and we have new developments. I love to hear your view of the significance of what Congress did at the end of the year around community schools.
For sure. It's an extraordinary testament to a couple of things. I think that on the one hand, there is an increased understanding from our policymakers, decision makers, and influencers on sort of not only just the need to really think about whole child strategies that take into account the science of learning and development, but also a recognition of the investments that are needed to start to sort of galvanize and seed this work. And then secondly, the work of practitioners, not just community school practitioners, but our colleagues who are doing out of school time work, expanded learning work, linked learning, a lot of civic education, all of these players coming together to really recognize that the work that we do is codependent, interrelated, and that we need to be very intentional about our interdependence in order to get the results and the impacts that we are looking for children, families, and communities.
To what extent would you say the concern driven by the NAEP scores that we saw in the fall was a driver of this investment?
Yeah, I think that there's, in some ways, bad news is news, right? It helps to center people's attention, give people a little bit more focus. I think the challenge is always when you have news that seems to be quite deficit-based, how do you double down on an asset-based strategy? Yeah. And I think that what we saw was certainly, it made sense that there was a downturn in NAEP scores. We all experienced a global pandemic.
Right. It would be surprising if that weren't the result.
Exactly. Right. Yeah. We are all humans.
Yes.
And as humans that experienced a massive pandemic, that is to be expected. And some of the brighter, wise practices and stories that came out that really affirmed an asset-based strategy that is focused on relationships, where the coherence of those community schools and those district and community level initiatives, where that relational infrastructure was already in place, and their ability to not just mobilize and respond to need, but mobilize and respond to learning, mobilize and strengthen teaching. Those things are, there's data within those areas that, dare I say, call them proof points, but they do shed light to say, hey, this isn't just a really nice, warm and fuzzy thing, that there is actually an art and science to this work. Right.
I love that. Thank you. When we talked a couple of months ago, you talked about some of the work that you're doing with the Brookings folks. And just before I let you go, I want to get an update on that and give folks access to new resources and new opportunities to learn.
Yeah, it's been an extraordinary 12 months working with the Community Schools Forward Task Force, over 50 organizations that are represented on the task force, but also a lot of other folks that have been part of working groups, and coming to a set of consensus conversations around what do what can we all say are the essentials of community schools implementation? It's a really, really big deal and foundational. We're really excited. We're actually going to have a launch of these resources in just a couple of days on January 12th.
Fantastic.
Having Brookings is hosting a virtual event along with our other coordinating partners at the National Center for Community Schools, the Coalition for Community Schools, and the Learning Policy Institute. And we'll be joined by Deputy Secretary Cindy Martin and Elsa Nash and others to really talk about how big of a deal it is to actually be able to name and to describe with sort of consistency what exactly it is, what we're talking about. We're talking about community schools.
That's fantastic. As we talked about last year, it can be elusive. So this seems like a crucial resource to people, and we will be happy to promote that out to our listeners.
That would be super.
Great. Thanks so much for joining us, and we look forward to checking in with you later in 2023 as things unfold.
That sounds great. Thanks so much, John.
You bet. Well, I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Jose and Hayin. I think it was a really good update. Now we're going to do the hybrid portion of this session. We're going to look back at some of the key portions of the conversation we had last year in which we did a deep examination of community schools. And in this part, you're going to hear again from Jose, who goes much deeper into the whole community schools movement. Then we're going to hear from two local leaders in this space. One is Jay Roscup from Wayne County, New York, and the other is our friend Karen Sanchez-Griego from Cuba, New Mexico, where she is the superintendent of schools. They're going to get deep into what is it like to implement community schools. Then we'll zoom back out, and we will be joined by Hayin again and by Shital Shah from the Department of Education, where she's the director of strategic partnerships, but most importantly, she is the person who is on point at the department around community schools. I hope you enjoy this conversation. Thanks.
Your question, a little bit about me, huh?
A little bit about you.
A little bit about me and how community schools came about my work, right? So, I grew up as the youngest out of four, I have three older sisters, and was raised by a single mother in the South Side of Chicago. Much of the things you all see in the news and hear in the news, grew up in those kind of streets there. And I was very fortunate, had a great mom. My father, John, if people don't know this, was actually a gang member. People don't know that about me. This plays a little bit into my story and why community schools, though. But so most people would say, he also passed when I was 17, but wasn't around in my life before that. So you may think that I may have been fatherless, but with my mom's support and how our community worked, I was very well fathered. I had lots of support from the gentlemen in the neighborhood and the ladies as well too. You couldn't walk around our neighborhood without going unnoticed. And you definitely couldn't walk around a neighborhood without going unaccountable. So my mother was a Chicago public school teacher. She became a teacher, in her 30s. But in our neighborhoods, despite all the chaos that was going around, we lived on what we like to call the Horseshoe on Sangamon Street in Chicago. And in that neighborhood right there, it was a tight-knit community where we all knew each other. And many of us are still friends today. Being a multiracial young person growing up in Chicago could often be difficult, and especially in the neighborhood. So mom did what most parents do. She tries to send me to other schools away from my community. So she actually sent me to the suburbs in Chicago, and I often felt kind of detached from the folks who actually supported me and didn't have the greatest experience going to other schools, some of them private, outside of my own neighborhood. So I grew up with community schooling. It wasn't directly through the school. Higgins Elementary was the elementary school that was about a 3-block away walk from my house. But I'm happy to see now when I travel back to that neighborhood that it is now Higgins Community Academy, and that the railroad tracks I probably should not have been hanging out on are now actually bike paths and walkways. So I can't help but think, because of how that community interacted and the stance it took for us young people in that neighborhood, that the revitalization of that neighborhood wasn't caused by that. And so community schools has pretty much been in my blood, and that's played out in my career over time. You're on mute there, John. We got to hear you.
Sorry. That's really useful background, Jose. It fills in a lot about you and your views about this. What, in your professional life, what was sort of the aha moment for you? Like, oh, this is the work that I really believe in. This is my path. This is what I want to do.
In that growing up, organizing has been pretty much part of my family and community culture. I started off a career with Boys and Girls Clubs back in the 90s, and we're surrounded by 3 different schools. During that time, the summer of 1996, I had the very heartbreaking, unfortunate experience of having to go into 6 different funerals of young people in our neighborhood. And although we ran what we typically is a friendly environment and welcoming environment for children, Boys and Girls Club, oftentimes right after when the bell rang, they would pass right by in a rush to get home. It was at that moment in the 90s, in my young 20s, where I realized that the school played a significant role in how we began to mobilize an entire neighborhood of the community, since most of the people who live there passed through there at some point. If nothing else, it has the ability to be the best communication vehicle to engage the broader public. So in my 20s, began to just work with some of the parents who I knew from the Boys and Girls Clubs and began to work with the different schools. That's a whole nother story, but a long story short, we began to shift and change how the mayor worked, how the police departments work. We developed a community task force, and from learning from the different parents, because I was brand new in my career, learning from the different parents and other more seasoned professionals in other institutions like the university and the county and the city, we mobilized that community where we began to see young people and police officers actually walking together in streets. We began to organize truce between Latinx gangs and Black gangs. We began to see the city begin to build new structures for senior communities. And I could probably walk you down from 2801 East Stewart in Las Vegas, Nevada to Fremont Street and give you a story of how communities band together year after year, even month after month, to really take back and redesign communities that they envision for their children now and for future generations. And to this day, good, bad, or indifferent, the current mayor of Las Vegas now, I remember her adopted child when she was the first lady, now the mayor, right there. So it was an aha moment then that a consistent communication vehicle that public schools provide, that the safety in bringing communities together and families together to kind of think through and redesign the lives they wanted to live in for themselves and for their children, how quickly that can actually transform a neighborhood. And I want to stress and emphasize, it didn't take long, because before then, when you talked about the positions, that was the catalyst. It was my community was the catalyst for my career. It wasn't me necessarily getting to know all these kind of things and studying. It was getting into the community and listening to and being willing to work alongside them to redesign that community. And that's what the aha moment was for me.
Jose, this is a perfect setup, because then I want to ask you, when you say the term community schools, when you advocate for community schools, what exactly is it that you're talking about? Because to me, it always sounds great. And then it feels, and we talked about this before, it can feel elusive. It can feel like everything. So when you say community schools, when you advocate, we'll hear from others in a couple of minutes, when you advocate for community schools, say to the audience what it is you mean.
This is about relationships. So community schools for me are social centers. Social centers are neighborhood, just like was described back in 1902, right? It's the social centers of their communities. This is a way to actualize and deepen relationships with people. It is regenerative. So they are social centers, hubs in their neighborhood that where people actually feel like they belong, like people work together consistently and for each other, and everyone begins to thrive and live the lives that they want to live. That's what it means to me. Oftentimes, I can tell you also too, John, just real quick on what it's not. And so when I came into this role back in 2017, I always, and I still do hear the terms of wraparound services. You take Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If all schools did, they do that now, give stuff to people, wraparound services, we keep everybody at the bottom of Maslow's pyramid. We're about engaging people and co-designing generations and generations. This is a regenerative approach to move folks. We all have stress in our lives, to move people from what stresses them out, from beneficiaries up the pyramid, maybe not Maslow's, to contributors, to partners, to leaders of their neighborhood and their community. That's when I say community schools, that's the vision I see.
So we know this event we're having today is part of a rising tide around community schools. Why is this happening? Besides your brilliance and charm and incredible leadership, why is this happening now? Why is this idea meeting this moment so powerfully?
Yeah, it doesn't matter the political spectrum. It just makes sense. Name another public facility in a community that has more communication power than a school. Name another place that can touch points and touch base with the majority of a population in a neighborhood. Name somewhere else a different strategy or approach that consistently uses that communication power to actually co-design life with one another. What we just experienced, what we still are experiencing through the pandemic right now, is one of the greatest enemies ever, and it's isolation. Isolation has caused us to just watch just the media that we want to watch, just the news channels we want to watch, open up our social media to what the social media platforms and respond to what we want to have. We get to invite and kick people out as we want. That's the greatest enemy that we have faced right now, is this isolation. So why right now, what we've experienced during this time are those places, those community school places that already had relationships established, that already had robust family engagement, were better prepared to respond to the pandemic. And my friend, I'm forgetting her name right now, in Tennessee, said, hey, the city started asking the school districts, and the school districts started asking for community schools, and we were prepared. We were ready to respond to learning needs, to basic needs that folks have, and young people during this time told us the same. So why right now is because we know that we actually need a mechanism, an approach, a strategy, whatever you want to call it, that consistently engages folks on a regular basis to co-design. So when life happens to one of us or all of us, that we're better prepared for it. What it also did, we realized that we've been talking about we don't have enough money to address everything, and that may be the case, but we began to see anchor institutions, cities, counties, school districts, United Ways, universities, chambers of Congress, business and philanthropy come together for this moment that we're going through right now. So why would we became more efficient with our time, we became more effective with our resources, and we definitely see that this is a definite equity strategy as it engages those who typically have been the least engaged from even designing the lives they want to live.
So this is fascinating, Jose, because when we talk about community schools, as soon as you say the word school, it conjures for all of us academic progress, and so forth. And I'm sure you can describe in a second how you think academic progress flows from this approach. But really what you're talking about here is a core community building approach. And I'm curious about the intersection of that core community building kind of approach with academic achievement.
So I'm a father of 5. That's my first occupation that should be on my bio, right? I'm a father of 5. I would say children, but one is in their 30s, 3 are in their 20s, and one's a senior in high school. So, so run the gamut. They've all, just like all, and I work with children, as you know, through my background. We often look at education and we look at the final result of what the public sees, grades and attendance, we don't look at why that's happening. All of my kids have experienced life somewhat. I'm in my second marriage, so my kids experienced divorce. That had an effect on them. And we all, as people, when we're stressed out, we don't even perform that well at work. Right now, what young people, school-age children go through, that's their work. If they're stressed out, if they have a number of factors that are causing them to stress and not focus and not even be comfortable coming, and there's no relationship there, how can we expect the numbers of education that we typically look to improve? If we never make things culturally relevant for what kids are immigrant and refugee children, our native children, our Asian Pacific Islanders, wherever language that you are, if we're not striving to learn how they learn and what they're going through, how do we ever expect to see education numbers actually improve? So it's a direct correlation, simply put there, but we need to move the conversation from, yes, that's one of the indicators we're looking at, but there's a whole set of different indicators. One, are you well off? Are you well-being? 2, are we having democratic processes in place to actually learn what's going on? What is culturally relevant for these different communities, and how can different people contribute? We could begin to have equity issues that is way beyond demographics of who's coming and who's not coming. What we're looking for in the numbers of education is the justice piece. We want to flip those numbers, but we got to go through a process first to get there.
Wow. All right. Emily said at the top of the show, 25,000 by 2025. It's got a nice ring to it. Where are you now? And how are you going to get from where you are now to 25,000? Because some
nice.
people listening right now are part of that 25,000. They're probably are part of what we got going on now.
I'm hoping everybody listening right now is part of that.
25,000. So tell us where we are and how we're going to get where we're going.
Yeah, I'll give you a quick story of how that came about. Yes, it's a great marketing, right? 25,000. But early on in my career here, we're meeting with the steering committee, which includes the unions, school-based health centers, Alliance, After School Alliance, some of the AASA, ALAS, the associations, a number of other organizations, and I know I'm missing a bunch of them. And we were just I was early in my role. It's like, how do we flip this around? We've already reached a tipping point of young people living in poverty. We went, when the study came out, 2016, 2015, about 51% of our children we're going the wrong way. So I'm on an airplane on one of my visits to the local communities, and happened to sit next to a guy from Sandia National Laboratory, which is right in Albuquerque where I worked. But we started talking about what I did. And he says, you just need a critical mass of schools to operate that way until they all operate that way. And I was like, let's talk about that. So we talked about that a little bit more. If you think about critical mass theory and tipping points, it usually takes about 30% of something to operate well until they all begin to operate that. So going back to the steering committee, and we're talking about it at one of our meetings that we had back in 2017, 2018, we started just doing the math. It's just about 100,000 schools, 98,000 plus public schools out there. So we need about 30%. So there's just about 25,000 Title I schools. So we adopted 25,000 community schools. Now, another thing about critical mass is that in order for it to work, you need it to happen in a quick time frame, because the longer you draw it out, then the people who are part of it change and it slows down. So we put pretty much a span between presidential terms to get there, to 25,000 to 2025. So the strategy in that is going back to flip that number of 51% living in poverty and the effects that it's having on the education data we just finished talking about, is to focus working with the federal government, working with state and government and local partnerships to actually really focus in on typically where there are high concentrations of kids who need us most, kids living in poverty. So the Title I schools.
What's the number now? If I pressed you, turned on the really bright lights and pressed you, what number of community schools would you say there are now?
If you press me, you get the real diplomatic answer. So you have a lot of people who have a lot of guesstimations on what's happening out there. I tell you this, this coming up year, we started already. We'll be going deeper on a census, because here you'll hear the arguments back and forth of, was it a quality community school versus non-quality? We're having the wrong conversation. We should be having a conversation is, what are the schools who are in it, who want to be in it, so we can determine how to get them better from a continuous improvement standpoint. How do we get them better? Because we want them all affecting by engaging people, by co-designing with folks, by collaborating and coordinating those activities together. And so that's what my answer I would give you as far as the how many pinpoint.
But I'm gonna okay, that's a good try, but I'm I mean, it doesn't have to be. I'm not asking for an exact number. Are we talking about there's 1,000 today? Are we talking about there's 2,500 and we're going to go 10x over in the next 5 years? Or are we talking there's something like 5,000 to 10,000 now?
I could tell you what I have right now. I have right now just shy of 2,500 actual school names that when we're done with our mapping and our census, that we will put on a map on our website.
Okay,
so
great.
Right now, about
we're talking. I mean, your bold play here. We're talking about big bets. Your bold play is almost 10x over the next 4 years.
Yeah, and it's doable. This is,
and that's doable.
It's doable. Here's the doable part. You already identified Title I schools. That's where high concentrations of kids who need us most. Brookings help us do that even more with the first Brookings task force. We'll hear from Hayin a little bit right there too. What's needed? What's needed right away? What's essential in the community school is a person whose job it is to wake up every day and coordinate this. We happen to call this person a community school coordinator, not by job title position, but by the functionality of their job. We need that. That is the price of a person. Yes, there are other programmatic things that we need, but that's where communities and states and federal government can also supply. But basically, and this is basically for all those out there, is we need a person whose job it is to wake up every day and begin to coordinate the relationships and resources for that school's community. Awesome. So that's a very doable task.
All right, excellent. Jose, fantastic. You stay with us, but I'm now going to invite our friends. It was a great conversation, but we're going to now hear from two people who are really on the front lines as leaders. Karen, are you turning on your camera? And Jay also. Hello, Karen. Thanks for joining. Hello, Jay. And then we have two national leaders in Shital Shah, who's with the Department of Education. Hey, Shital, thank you. And Hayin Kimner, who is leading in California and, as Jose just mentioned, coordinating the work of the Brookings Task Force. Thank you all for joining. I want to start with our practitioners, our folks who are really out there doing this, so that we can give people who are listening a little picture of what it is that Jose was just talking about. Karen and Jay, I want to ask both of you in turn. Let's start with Karen. A little description of the community in which you're operating. Like, what kind of geography are we talking about? Both of you are in more rural places. What kind of spaces are we talking about? And what kind of conditions and young people are you dealing with? Karen, you start.
Okay, thank you for having me. We are in Cuba, New Mexico. Sometimes when I tell people I work in Cuba, they think it's the country. We're in Cuba, New Mexico, which is about an hour and 20 minutes outside of urban Albuquerque. Our students predominantly are Native American and come from 4 reservation sites into the local school district. We are about 72% Native American Diné and 23% Hispanic. Of our Diné students, they are multiracial. So 50% of that, 72%, 50% of them are Hispanic and or other. Our kids travel in about 2 hours at the latest point a day. So they're on the bus 4 hours a day. They get on, some of them, the little ones, early in the morning at 5:30. Our kids, so in New Mexico, our districts are rated in terms of at-risk factors, and Cuba has the highest at-risk factor in the state of New Mexico. So we have 89 school districts. Our school district is the 89th highest risk factors in the state of New Mexico. Our kids deal with a lot of difficult things, as they do in all parts of the country, right? Impoverishment, just the kind of things that we see going on in all communities, in the community that I grew up in as well. But there's also a lot of beauty. They've got huge, amazing contributions they give in terms of language and culture and spirit and what they believe. And then we're just a local kind of drive-through town, if you will, and our economic development is not there. So that's just an overall picture of where we are in New Mexico, or at least in Cuba, ISD.
Jay, you want to talk a little bit about where you are out in Western New York?
Well, yeah, and when Karen said, when she says Cuba, people think of the country. We say we New York, people think of like skyscrapers, and I constantly reminding them, no, here we're talking like orchards, cows, things like that. And really out in Western New York, between Rochester and Syracuse. So we're along Lake Ontario. And, we've got those 2 urban centers, but if you check out the stats on Rochester, a lot of poverty. And I think that we have seen really over the past 2 decades, a steady economic decline. So when, you're looking at brands like Kodak and Xerox, were name brands. There have been slight changes in the film industry in the last 20 years. I don't know when the last time somebody took a roll of film to be developed was, but that impacted us very much locally here. Our per capita household income was actually higher 20 years ago in Wayne County than it is now.
Wow.
And so what we really have is a kind of a cratering out of a lot of our local economy. And so we have smaller populations, and the folks that remained are typically those that had less money. We have a lot of the engineers moved, a lot of other folks moved. And so we have remaining a higher concentration of poverty. And so our rural poverty is something that is expressed in isolation, is expressed in limited access to resource, and looks like something that like where the folks on the eastern part of our county, farther away from Rochester, have 10 years less life expectancy than the folks on the western side. And so if you think about that, to what Jose was talking about, right? We're really moving beyond a lot of times just academics, but we're really talking about a right to live as long as the national life expectancy. I don't want folks in my county to be born and have a lower life expectancy than if they were born in the nation of North Korea, which is what we're seeing. And that's really an equity point, as Jose indicated.
So each of you made a decision to move in the direction of a community schools approach. Curious, you each just described the circumstances of the communities in which you work. Why did you move to a community schools approach? And then to that conversation I was just having with Jose, what does that exactly mean for you, mean in your community? Karen, I'll come back to you.
Okay. Well, when I was working, I grew up in the South Valley in Albuquerque. My mother was not educated. My dad was working, and we used to come home from school and say, this isn't happening at school. And she would say to us, they're not going to listen to me. I'm not an educated woman. And I used to think about this and thought, you know what, her voice should be as powerful as anybody else's, no matter what her status in education or what it is. So as a young student, when I decided I was going to get educated, I said I will always be a strong advocate for voice. And so we started this when I was in Albuquerque Public Schools. I was on loan to the University of New Mexico, and we had a Kellogg Foundation grant. There was millions of dollars, and part of what they did was really look at family centers at the time. They weren't called community schools. This is a while ago. And really we started developing, how do you bring community voice? How do you hear kids? How do you hear families? How do you bring in your local chapters? How do we not duplicate? We're spending multitudes of money duplicating things that are happening in our schools. And so I kind of came with that lens. My dissertation was really, I studied this for 5 years in poor and impoverished communities. And really, it was like we don't operate well in hierarchies, is what I found out in my work. And really, that flatter structures that are like, you're my neighbor. I think José talked about it as well. You can go across the street, you see who I am. Jay talked about it as well, and this whole collaborative feeling of loving one another. And so when I was asked to come to Cuba, I said, you know, we're gonna approach the district as this. And one thing I want to say in terms of just hearing and seeing some of the things in the chat box is that it can't just be a side note, community schools. It has to be a systematic approach to how we're running school districts. And so as a superintendent, I will tell you that everything in line, decisions on budget and hiring and students' voice and powerful voice, et cetera, has to really does this importance of really engaging families and communities and other organizations and making them feel like they're wanted at all levels. We also are collecting data, and this is the last I'll say because I need to move on, is on whether or not community schools are successful. We did this when I was at an APS, when we were at the university, and now that we're in Cuba. And we are literally linking dollar to dollar cost. What does it look like in terms of student academics, and how does each program and each thing that comes together support their well-being, and how we're showing success?
Jay, that was Karen, that was amazing. Thank you. Jay?
It was amazing. And it was also too specific for me to just say what Karen said. Like, I can't just, it's not fair. So, but
she's good. She's good.
No, a decade ago, the federal government invested in Safe Schools, Healthy Students projects, a little more than a decade ago, after Columbine, actually. I'd be really interested if anybody on the call was involved in a Safe Schools, Healthy Students project. We have folks that have been part of that work really scattered across the nation. But Department of Ed, Department of Justice, Health and Human Services came together. And in my first admin role, I was the project director there and got a chance to see, what co-located behavioral health looked like, what relationships with community partners that were integrated into an after-school program and during the day looked like. And we started a countywide partnership that came out of that has held for a decade and really has been a way that all of our community partners can gather. But what we found is it's not enough for me to say, right, that Soda Central School District and Wayne County Behavioral Health Network get along really well if I mean that Nelson Kais, superintendent, and Jim Heights, director, get along great and collaborate great, right? We really need to do the work together. So I really need the counselor that is co-located at SOTAs to get along well with the school counselor and the school psychologist and the school principal. And I think that for us, it has really been out of necessity that we have zippered those resources together, if you will. And because it's exactly like Karen said, we need more money to do the work because it's always what we say. But the reality is that we have to work with what we've got. And for all of us, education is just one service sector. There are monies in drug prevention for youth services. There are monies for preventive work in mental health care. There are monies for education of youth and families in public health. And we can bring all those dollars together. If I could draw everyone's attention to to the logo that is on, Hayin's logo there for California Learning Exchange. And you see that one open door, and then you can go into all the other doors. That's it. It's right there. It's a brilliant logo. I've been looking at it for several minutes. I'm like, there it is. That's it. So that's what we're really trying to do, is to make our school, the families can walk in, the youth can walk in, and then they can get to those resources. Closing on that, John, is just that for us, we're meeting a need that is something as simple as closing the geographical gap. It can be a 45-minute trip to get to a service. And I know longer. Karen already in our planning calls, I was amazed at the gaps that Karen has to cover just geographically. So when we're talking about closing gaps, we're talking about access. It's something as simple as geography can really be a barrier for families.
John, can I say one quick thing in terms of what they said? I just wanted to say that one of the things that we've learned, especially now working in Cuba, is to push our resources out. So one of the things that we figured out was with our little ones traveling in to come to preschool, we said, you know what, we met with the local chapter houses, and they said, we've got this old building, and we went to the state of New Mexico and said, can we use some of the funding in order to refurbish that building so the kids don't have to get on a bus, especially 3 and 4-year-olds, to come into the school district. So we've really been pushing a lot. So we're expanding Cuba schools from just the perimeter of our schools to say we exist in Ojo and Torreon and other places. So I just wanted to just also say that is that I think our world is kind of saying you don't have to just be in this geographical location. Schools are notorious for that we can be located all over our surrounding communities. And so anyway.
So I want to push each of you. I'm about to call on Shital and Hayin also, but I want to ask each of you sort of what I asked Jose, which is, look, this is the campaign for grade level reading, right? So we're particularly interested in helping young people with early school success. And I'm curious if you have observations about how this approach has been particularly helpful with early school success for kids who are maybe growing up in struggling communities or in challenging circumstances. Jay, why don't you go ahead and start?
Well, we have a program with literacy volunteers in our area, and Derek Poole came to me years ago and said, look, we're going to do this program. And I said, well, what do you need? He's like, I don't need much. I need a stage. I need a rocking chair. I need a carpet. I need a lamp. And I want to hang Our Community Reads banner in the background. I'm like, well, don't you need some snacks, or don't you need some this, or don't you need some that? Or can't we have some resources? Or can we do some tables? He's like, no, I just want a carpet, a rocking chair, and a lamp. And I'm going to read to the children. I'm like, we need to do it. No, we didn't. And it was beautiful. And it continued to be beautiful. And literally, it is no joke to say that we would typically clear 100 people showing up. And, families would show up, the children would go up, Derek would model the reading. And then we started to canvas and move out around. There would be an Our Community Reads event at the bank. And there was an Our Community Reads event out at a farm. And they would do costumes sometimes and do more, but for the most part, it was just simple. And I think that the thing that I believe that community schools is, as much as it's a big bet and it's one idea, it also sticks to one of our core principles for our operations, which is that small is the new big, and really believing that small, impactful things can make a huge difference. And then I think that there's a way then that all of that national energy can really transfer down locally. And there are young people now that have a memory of being read a story and being read a story in a setting. And there are parents that are empowered and have a chance to take home some books and read and carry out that same kind of conversation and that same kind of experience at home. So that's one example. And, they're just read alouds is such a powerful strategy for boosting the identity of young people as readers, young people as writers. And again, I could go on about that experience and a few others, but that was one that came to mind for sure.
Great. Karen, quickly before I turn to Hayin and Shital, the contribution to early school success, particularly in the literacy domain?
Yeah, we, because a lot of our kids are Navajo Diné, we wanted to, we went back and looked at purchasing books from pre-K all the way up that were relative and that were in both languages, Spanish and Diné, predominance of our kids. Look like them, books look like them. So we did a lot of that, got them out to the communities early on. This last year, we've also have been purchasing a book a month that kids get and their families get, and anybody in our district can read. So let's say our custodian is going to be on one day a month, and he's going to be on a Zoom, and especially because we're adding Starlink connections in our area, they get on and they do reading of the book that the kids have received. And same thing, it's happening in our local community down the strip in some of our restaurants and some of our banks, etc. And so now parents will ask us, hey, what book are the kids going to get this month? And we're also documenting and trying to see, how many books are they reading, and how, where do we need to interject in terms of supporting reading components. And we want our kids to see that everybody's reading as well, right? That regardless of what job you have, it's not just the teacher, that it's everybody. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Shital and Hayin, thanks for your patience in waiting. But I know that you guys have been at this work for a long time, and so it must be exciting for you to hear this. I'm curious, but I'm going to get to your specific expertise in a second, but I'm just curious as you listen to Jose and Karen and Jay, like what's popping for you about what's happening here and the idea. Hayin, you want to start?
I was just about to point to Shital. So thanks, John. There's so much popping. I have written down in my notes just a bunch of things that folks have said. I think just to most immediately, what was popping for me as Dr. Sanchez-Griego was talking was just the importance of centering language and culture, that this is not about extra wraparound, right? This is about making those relationships real, and then also valuing the students and the families and the communities, and starting learning where they are. In California, we are working with our partners at the Sobrato Early Academic Language organization to really think about, community schools is not just about the integrated student supports. That is important. And if we can't, as schools, really think about how is it that we're creating linguistically, culturally affirming and sustaining places to be and to learn, then we're not doing our jobs well, especially if we're trying to advance equity. So that was one of the things. And something that Jay said also, and this has a lot of relevance for the small school districts and rural schools and charter schools that we're working with in California. Small is the new big for lots of reasons, for all of the infrastructure of all of those youth serving, family and community serving agencies that exist. How is it that we are really thinking about the realities of that zippering, that grading, in a way that actually makes sense to where young people are? And that looks really different in these small rural contexts, and it does in sort of the administrative bureaucracies of Oakland, where I am joining you all from, or LA or Chicago. I'm from Chicago too, so just got to put that up there. Yeah, a lot of Shah in the house. But I think those realities, if we can figure out what that zippering looks like, and not to put it on the shoulders and backs of our smalls and rurals. If we at our levels of policy and systems transformation can do that heavy lifting, then the small is the new big, right? That is a way to really give us the blueprint for how this needs to work. So that was another thing. The third thing, just one last thing, and it's about educational equity. And I have been doing this work to be specifically about educational equity. And if we think about the analogy of the canary in the coal mine, yes, we can talk about putting masks on the canaries, but if we're not talking about the coal mine and what it is that we're doing to really transform that coal mine, right? We're all supposed to be moving towards renewable energy. This is not just about
making sure that that canary has what it takes to succeed in a coal mine. This is about really questioning what's the cage about and what's the coal mine about. So those are three things.
Wow, fantastic. Thank you so much. Shital, while you get ready, I'm just going to call out to everybody. We're going to turn to questions in a few minutes. So if you post your questions in the Q&A, Emily will be harvesting those questions and feeding them to our panelists shortly. Also, some of them can just be answered. So if you have a question for one of our panelists specifically, just shoot it there. Okay, Shital, we gave you a little time to think.
Yeah, you did. And I'm going to
ask you questions with your official hat on of the U.S. Department of Education. But first, I'm going to ask you as a community schools, historically involved and a huge enthusiast. When you hear what you heard today, tell me what's popping for you.
Yeah, Hayin captured it all, which is why going after her always stinks. But the one thing that both Dr. Griego and Dr. Roscup mentioned was the importance of the trust and the relationship building and collaboration. And people often want to jump to collaboration without doing the other things. And and then potentially thinking, well, money can help drive this, but it's in fact the trust and the relationships that drive it. And I'm sure both of our expert practitioners can attest to that and have, in fact, right? And what I want folks to think about is how do we have this strategy continue beyond transitions? And I know Hayin has been, working on that for years as well, is when, Jay and Karen retire, hopefully, right? Whenever you do, that there's someone there in the district. And how are you building that capacity amongst everyone in the district, including the educators? So I'll stop there. That's what sort of it sparked in me, is building that. Mm-hmm.
So let me come right back to you.
Yeah.
If small is the new big,
Mm-hmm.
if this is fundamentally local and relationship driven, as everybody has so nicely described, what's the role of $400+ million of federal money?
So
what's
I think
that for?
No, thank you. And 443, hopefully, if everything gets passed, which will help to the initial question you started with, Jose, around how many community schools, can help create 800 new community schools, reaching about 2.5 million students, right? So the hope with that big investment is to encourage just that. If you look through the current priorities that are out there right now, which feedback is due by February 11th, we have tried to infuse it with underscoring the importance of partnership, right, in collaboration, so that it's not just driven by money, and applications are submitted and the work is done with a variety, not just one sort of, not just district driven or community based driven, but that there is a true relationship. So I don't know if that answers your question. Go ahead.
No, that's super helpful. But what exactly can schools, communities spend that money on that supports the kind of building that you're describing?
Sure. I mean, it certainly can they spend the money on site coordination, district coordination, right? And other programs and supports needed based on a needs and asset mapping of what, and that community engagement process is critical to what I was saying earlier as well.
Right. So, Hayin, California is making a big investment, bigger even than the federal government. For what? How big? Like, what's happening there?
Yeah, California is taken a real big bet on community schools, and it is not coming out of the blue. But the Community Schools Partnership Program grant is $3 billion for $3 billion with a B for planning, implementation, and coordination grants. And the idea is that if all goes well, Jose, that we might be able to support implementation fidelity at upwards of maybe 3,000 schools across California. And this, there's sort of the long history of this work, as somebody had posted in the Q&A, and even the language behind supporting the whole child is nothing new. This is the Healthy Start legislation in the 90s, and then even renaming that in the 2000s to being about Healthy Start community schools. I mean, this work around integrated student supports has been long lasting. I think what COVID did in California and across the nation is made that link unavoidably obvious, the link between well-being and learning, and well-being and teaching and learning. And really taking a look at the impact of COVID on all of our communities and helping us to sort of reimagine a different context, not just in terms of what schools look like, but what do the public systems supporting and really strengthening our young people, their schools and communities to thrive. So, you know, this takes a lot of effort, and it does take a lot of money. And the $3 billion of the Community Schools Partnership Program is really just one part of the budget to support community school strategies. If we look at the over $4 billion to support expanded learning, if we look at the additional monies around universal pre-K and really wanting to expand pre-K for 4-year-olds, all of that is part of the community school strategy, as are the investments in multi-tiered systems of support in children and youth behavioral health, really thinking about all of these different dimensions of having our public systems work better.
So I think one of the key, I want to turn to questions. Emily, I'm just going to flag for you that I want to turn to questions in a couple of minutes. I think one of the key challenges, I'm really curious how you're thinking about, Shital, at the department and you, Hayin, in California is, like, we know what government money's like. And what we've heard about from Jay and from Karen are very particular community solutions. And so we need a program where we need funds that go out that support a wide degree of flexibility, right? And adaptability to local conditions. At the same time, we know when we're talking about taxpayer money, we want rigor, we want outcomes, we want, evidence-based. So how do you balance the need for flexibility on the one hand with the demands that come with taxpayer dollars? Shital, what's your thought on that? And how might people who are in communities thinking about, okay, this sounds great and getting some money would be great, but if you look at it from a community perspective, like, yes, I need money, and I understand it comes with some strings, but are there like super particular things I need to do? Is this going to turn into a giant compliance exercise, or do I have a lot of flexibility?
Well, I'll say with the full service community schools grant, there is flexibility. I mean, you're creating the plan based on this process, a community engagement process. So you're creating what you're going to hold yourself accountable to. If you look at Title I funding, if you're using it for site coordination, that's what you're using. I mean, and Jay and Karen can talk more to what the compliance looks like around Title I. And then if you're looking at ARP funding, that's in your LEA plan to the state of how you're going to use the monies, right? So you're creating sort of your own accountability. I do want to add, John, if I may, there was a question around philanthropy. And I think there is a huge space or a huge benefit of having philanthropy in the space, because they can, I think Karen mentioned earlier, or someone did, because there's just been so much knowledge dropped around philanthropy, creating those spaces where their learning can take place And we can help both the small, medium, and large-sized districts sort of learn from each other, especially around, and what Hayin said, the sustainability and cross-sector work, because the cross-sector work is also where this funding conversation needs to happen, right? We all know the burden of funding and supporting community schools isn't just a SEA or LEA issue. And so, but there's a lot more work in terms of learning across districts that I think can happen, and California is really tapping into that with Hayin's leadership and others. So I hope I answered your question.
Yeah,
I
you
never
did.
know, sometimes
Hey,
I ramble. Okay.
No. That was really helpful. And I think it's a hard question. Hayin, we talked about this a little the first time we met. And this question of rigor, like, there's a lot of money. We really want outcomes. We're frustrated and hopeful about kids. And at the same time, it's an approach, and it's an approach to change a system. So how does that all work with the kind of rigor that we want and expect?
Yeah, I think a lot of times when we think about government grants and government money, it is sort of easy to just immediately go to compliance and accountability. And I think one of the things that you've heard from everybody here is that the community schools work and really grounding it in strong relationships really transforms that nature of what accountability looks like. And so when we think about accountability, it isn't just to Shital and US Ed. Shital's the person behind all of the grant reports. She's not. But it really is about creating a different conversation about accountability, and not just, are you doing what I said you can do, but how is it that accountability turning around to our other public agency partners to say, you are also accountable for student success, and how do we support that conversation? I think that's one. I think the second is, we do need rigor in being able to say what is and what is not community schools. It is difficult if, the system's transformation, it's transformation for a reason, right? This is a huge paradigm shift. But in doing a paradigm shift, you don't just, let 1,000 flowers bloom. This can no longer just be a values-based conversation around collaboration and equity. What we do know is that there have been decades of lessons learned and practitioner-led work around saying this is what needs to be in place in order to make these community school strategies worthwhile. And I think what is really great about what is proposed in the expansion of the full service community school grant program, and just for you all to know that there still is some time for public comment on that proposed notice of priorities. But building in technical assistance is really important. We're not going to have rigor until we can really think about coaching, right? There's some ironies. We're talking about schools here. You don't test kids just to say, what do you know? You support them along the way to really being able to do this work. And similarly in California, there's been a big investment similar to our friends and colleagues in New York State to provide technical assistance as part of that grant, and to be able to ensure that there's some coherence to what that content, that methodology, and those implementation principles actually look like.
It's great. I'm going to turn to Emily in just a second for some questions. But Jose, you've been patiently listening, and it must be so fun and exciting for you to hear all this conversation. I'm just curious, when you think about community schools and you think about what Shital and Hayin said in sort of reflection on Jay and Karen, what do you see as the essential, the non-negotiable parts of community schools? Like, oh yeah, you can do some nice stuff, but it's not a community school in your view until and unless it has these things. What are these things that you're always looking for?
No, I appreciate that question. So some of it that first come to mind is not so much these things, but how we operate. I think it's essential of the consistency and frequency of conversations they have with their community, their families, their students, their teachers, how they bring them together to actually co-design. So I think one of these things would be a co-design plan, and they can quantify that to go into some funding things like how many people were engaged and what percentage of those people are still contributing. When I hear about the big, even going small, how many small communities are participating and what are the designs they're thinking of and implementing? So I think it's some of these ways. The number one, these things to me is, like I said before, it'd be great if we could look on the BLS one day, Bureau of Labor Statistics, and see the community school coordinator position, because there's so many of them on there, because that is a person who is a builder, creator, and facilitator of those types of conversations that we hope to continue to train, as Hayin was talking about, and improve the quality. The other things that comes out of that from this conversation I'm hearing too, the agility of funding when you talk about public-private partnerships. If you're looking for right now the solution, then you probably won't get the how community schools operate in the beginning as far as engaging folks. But the way that the federal government is moving towards, and for schools to begin to, here's some funding to actually go engage those folks. How do we begin to measure that type of engagement, collaboration? And then what of that turns to the things that make it agile enough so people can use immediately? Because where we are right now as a country, we do most places do like an asset and needs assessment at the beginning. And by the time they get any type of resources or getting around to doing something, that population's already moved on in a lot of places. So those are some of the things I think through how some of the conversations have.
That's really helpful. Karen, I want to come back to you as we go to questions. I know you've got a lot of things going on. You're a superintendent, but I want to come back to you for 1 second. When we talked before, you talked about this is not a program. The essential thing that people need to recognize, this is not a program. This is an approach and a systems change. Can you go back to that a little bit for us?
Yes, and I was just going to send a note. I've got to jump off. I've got an employee sitting in my office. There was an emergency that happened at the middle school, so I'm going to jump off here in a second. But I did want to say to everybody, I think what I've learned before, like you use that money and you hire liaisons and you do all that stuff. What happens in school districts is they just become a side note. Go to the community schools. You need glasses, go there. You need this, go there. Go. And it really doesn't help the change in the system. No one takes accountability that this approach to understanding kids and the connection between what's happening in their lives connects to what really happens academically. And so I think, as we spend the money, as we talk more about this, as our people from the state, from the National Education Department and others working in other states really look at this, that we really push out the fact that it's got to be a systems change. I think somebody said this earlier, right? We're going to retire. It should never be that. It should always be that your system operates in what's the best interest of kids. The other thing I'm going to say quickly too is that when we talk about rigor, I heard us talking about rigor, and I will tell you that I think there has been a stigma and a mindset that community schools are not rigorous. That's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. If you have high functioning community schools, they're very rigorous because you are collecting data. And I will say that the collection of data is in multiple ways. And the state and the nation has allowed us to prove this. And we posted a video, or they put a video in there, and you can see our community school. We want people to see what it looks like, the richness of what it is to live in a place where you don't have electricity and you don't have water. But guess what? You're still going to be a nurse. But guess what? You still have all these opportunities. So again, I would just say that the push out for that is really a strong long-term commitment to community schools as a systems change, not just we're going to get this infusion of money and bam, here we go. No, we know that these are rigorous institutions. They do a lot of work, and the most high functioning of institutions that implement community schools at a platformed level and work with their local communities, whether you're in a large urban district or a small district like I'm in now, does show effects. And there's multiple ways to collect data on this and tell the story. So I absolutely apologize. There was something that happened at the middle school where I have an employee here, so I have to step.
Good luck. Thank you so much for
everybody.
joining us.
I appreciate all your work.
Karen. We know you're a superintendent, so Hands on your time.
I could brag on her more when she was a principal also.
Yeah, well, there we got a little real-time view of what it's like to run a school district. Emily, I'm going to call on you and see if there's some questions that you want to.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone, our great expert speakers who are responding to some of the questions. So I think there's been a theme of questions that I'd love to just open up. And Jay, I'm probably going to ask you to answer this. But the question is really, what does a day-to-day look like for somebody who's in that role of coordinating for a community school? And then also, what are the other key roles to support the community school system and efforts?
Sure. So, I think if the day-to-day looks the same day-to-day, you're probably not doing it right. That's the first. The second is that, our premise locally here has been that, especially in rural schools where we cannot always fund a coordinator, that you need coordination. And so sometimes it's done with team. And we have really focused on organizing everything with a multi-tiered system of supports. And so that person really should be asking, what is it that all students need? What do some students need? And what do a few individuals need? And then they will move to meet those needs. And sometimes for a coordinator, that's going to mean personally walking a referral to an office. Sometimes that's going to mean convening a meeting. Sometimes that's going to mean sitting in a student support team. But always, if you're fortunate enough to have a community school coordinator, that person should be someone that is connecting other people and changing things from like, so-and-so needs a referral to Delphi to, so-and-so needs to go talk to Sarah. And to make sure, like, I just want to echo what Jose says about relationships. And then I think those tiers of support help give us lanes to drive in and help us identify gaps. And that coordinator day-to-day role, and I know it is annoying when people want a definite answer, but it has to be shaped by the place. It is place-based, person-centered. And when people are like, how will this make sense? It will make sense when you stand in the place of a child in a community and you ask, what do you need? And when you're answering that question, then it makes sense. When you're trying to figure out how it makes sense from the high offices of the land, it can get maybe a little confusing. And that's where, though, when you sit in, that, geesh, this young person needs clean teeth. This young person needs good nutrition. This young person needs to learn how to cope with some really challenging stuff. This young person needs to learn how they learn. This young person needs people they can trust. When you're organizing the work around meeting the needs of first an individual child and then a community of children, then it all just falls into place. And it's really not that hard to figure out if you start with a child. If you start with adults, it turns into a big mess.
So just building on that a little bit. So I want to go back to that question because I think this person who's an anonymous question poser was wanting to hear more like the specific roles within the school, within the district. I mean, obviously we had a superintendent, former principal here. And then building on that, Benjamin Kramer's asking what needs to be done to take care of teachers, draw in new teachers, and level set for great work. So it's sort of like, talk a little bit more about like the specific people that make this successful within a school. And then also like, how are you bringing in new teachers to do this work and taking care of them?
Can I start that off real quick,
Yes,
Jay,
of
if you don't
course,
mind? So just kind of building off of what Jay says, he's right. We're working on right now with Hayin and Brookings right now to actually codify some core functions of a coordinator. But what the day-to-day looks like is going to depend on the local context of the community. How you know you have a good coordinator? I'll give you a quick story of one elementary school I was going to. A friend of mine who was a coordinator and working with their principal. They argue like sisters, the coordinator and the principal, but they were the best of friends at the same time. I was in a meeting in Shital. I believe you were there when you worked with the American Federation of Teachers. You came to Albuquerque, and the coordinator was facilitating a meeting amongst teachers. And Shital leaned over to me first thought that there was a teacher or a principal. I said, well, no, that's, oh no, assistant principal, you thought it was. I said, no, that's the community school coordinator. So the level of what Hayin was talking about, a professional trained to actually facilitate where somebody brand new to the school couldn't even tell the difference of this from an administrator to a person who is project managing all these relationships and coordinating all these relationships and resources. Teachers at that school, brand new one, this coordinator functions so high, they oftentimes would mistakenly bring their timesheets to sign and say, well, no, I can't do that. I'm the community school coordinator. So what it looks like is that families are really leading in multiple areas around the school, and you actually lose your leadership as a coordinator. You have no idea who is the lead. You just see a lot of people leading. So that's some things you can see when you have a great coordinator who's facilitating and coordinating resources and building those relationships, creating avenues to build deeper relationships, and even in the form of preparing educators. And I mean by preparing, I don't mean telling them what to do, but actually engaging them of how to integrate their work that they're trained to do at universities currently, and what community knows how to best address their kids.
So building on that a little bit, this great question just came in from Riso Barrios. Is there a space, like maybe talk more specifically for parent leaders and volunteers? Like what are their roles in this work?
Jay, you want to lead that one off? I was going to jump in, but I want to.
No, well, Jose, if you're going to jump in, go right ahead. I'll follow you.
What are parents' role? What's a parent's role in their household?
Like if they're like, I want to volunteer to make this community school successful, what are some of the things that parents are doing to that to build success?
One, let me get tangible. Let me get real tangible. They're included in the professional development with teachers. They're in the design discussions with principals and even superintendents in districts. They have the resources and autonomy to lead projects and teams of people towards certain projects, just to kind of get tangible as far as some of the things that happen. There's a homework diner video out there that NBC Nightly News did. And when they came to film that at the same school that coordinator I talked about, one of the guests said, well, who's leading homework diner? Because all they saw were parents executing roles to make a homework diner happen. They had no idea who was the actual leader. So a parent's role is as they create it when it's coming to the care of their children and doing the multiple things people heard on this call here.
Yeah, so kind of braiding a few of those things together, I think, again, it's so localized, and that is a lot of our teachers drive in, they drive in 30, 35 minutes, and then they drive home. And that can lead to really having to be intentional about building connections between parents and teachers. And that ultimately, a lot of times, is really, when I'm a parent, I want to know what my kids' teachers see, right? Like I got two kids, and, it's not the superintendent that knows, whether they've got friends at lunch or not. It's not the superintendent that knows, if they're being kind to others. And building those relationships with folks that are really settled in their life 35, 40 minutes away from where our kids live in a completely different setting is something that takes some intentionality. And I think that for parents, sometimes we have to be very, very, very explicit, very tangible, as Jose said, to create opportunities. And they can be, again, starting very small. Not will you serve on this committee until the end of all time, so that you can sign this Title I form for us once a year. But, could you help us? Could you help us with this one event? We're going to do. Could you be a celebrity reader for us? Could you come in, and if we send some stuff home, even don't want to come in, can we send some stuff home? You can cut up and prep these craft materials and send them back. And, anything we can do to build an opportunity small and then turn that into a relationship. Don't ever get away from what Jose said about relationships in this work. And ultimately, when we really have parents that want to help our community schools grow, they become our credible messengers that can say, you know what, I know that Jay looks like an old, scary, bald guy, and you're a 21-year-old, and your kid is heading into, UPK. But I talked with him, and he seems pretty chill. So why don't you go with me, and we'll go talk to Jay about your concern. And so when we've got parents that are helping us build relationships with other parents, then I think we know we're winning.
And Hayin, you answered this, but it's a great question from Allison Gubera, who said the state of California is rolling out community schools grants, but the context for this is decades of underfunding in our school systems. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how advocates can ensure that these grants are implemented in a transformational way that centers community voice and co-creation and doesn't just backfill gaps. You all touched on that a little bit, but I'd love to hear more.
Yeah.
That.
This is relevant, certainly not just in California, but everywhere, as we sort of see public education come under fire, and where we see lots of questions around public investments and budgets and the public good. And I think that one of the things that is an absolute truth across all community schools is that you cannot build strong and sustainable and transformative community schools without baseline adequate funding for public education. This cannot be on the backs of, again, our folks at the ground level trying to be scrappy and be resourceful, because they will do that anyway, but they can only do as much as with what we give them. So when we're looking at, and the Brookings Task Force, one of the things that we are doing is led by the Learning Policy Institute team, is looking at costing and what is the cost of community school approaches. Well, when I look at a sustainable and effective community school, I want to see highly qualified teachers. I want to see highly qualified teachers and leaders that are able to say, I am valued as a professional and I am supported to be effective. And that means that those schools have instructional coaches. That means there are community-based partners that are providing professional learning around social and emotional learning, around positive behavior, around restorative justice. Those are all baseline pieces of what is part of community schools. And I think that if we continue to sort of distract folks in thinking that community schools is sort of icing on the cake, we lose sight of what the premise is, right? And Dr. Sanchez-Griego talked about that this is not just about all the extras. This has to be about the fundamental investments that we were putting into public education. And so in California, this is something that we have been talking about, especially when we look at the local control funding formula, the weighted student funding formula, that we are not going to go back to pretending that if we just throw some change in very fragmented ways, that somehow magical transformation is going to happen. This requires us being really eyes wide open, not only on what those investments are, but being very honest about the structural deficits that are just the truth across this nation, whether we're talking about pensions, pension liabilities, whether we're talking about facilities, and the useful life of facilities, whether we're talking about technology. I mean, if we're not also having these conversations as part of a community school conversation, then we're not being serious about transformation or sustainability.
Any other thoughts on that? So building on this idea, but then kind of going back to the question around parents' role, we have this big question around what about advocacy? So what can parents do to advocate to make sure that money for community schools is creating a high quality community school and meeting needs in a real authentic way? So the question really is about advocacy, and thinking about that, what role did advocacy play in getting the funding in California and getting the funding federally?
Jose, I think you're pointing at me. Advocacy in California has been longstanding, and this hasn't just been about something that's been called community schools. You know, our strongest advocates are those that have been screaming about, with young people, shoulder to shoulder, about being relationship centered and student centered. And I think that the work around, you know, we talk about parent leaders and parent volunteers. This is about ownership. This is about community ownership of recognizing what needs to be in place for high quality teaching and learning environments, for equitable opportunities and access to those high quality teaching and learning environments. And so that type of advocacy, you know, is a little bit hallmark of California, certainly of the Bay Area. But really thinking about this not as just making the case in terms of we need more, but it is, you know, what Jay just wrote in the chat, demanding excellence. And so that advocacy is incredibly important.
Well, thanks for joining us for this special session in which we took a look at recent developments on community schools and also revisited some of the basic important information about the whole community schools movement. We really appreciate the participation of José and Hayin and hope that you found this all very useful. For more information, as Hayin mentioned, Brookings has an event in just 2 days. So I really recommend signing up for that and participating in that event as well. I think it's going to be a very rich thing. And we'll look forward to you joining us as we return to regular programming next Tuesday. We'll be taking another look at how educators, districts, and states are really coming together to strengthen kindergarten as that key inflection point as young people enter school. So join us next Tuesday at 3 o'clock. And again, thanks for joining us today and Happy New Year. We'll see you next week. So long.